great virtue in life is real courage that knows how to face facts and live beyond them. That's a quote by D.H. Lawrence. Organizations today have not yet learned or have not yet moved beyond the impact of hierarchy and bureaucracy. Even so, more is possible. No one really wants to compromise because compromising means giving up something. When two desires are integrated, no one has had to sacrifice anything. That's a quote by Mary Parker Follett. This means that what your team can do is look for a solution, look for an integrated solution that satisfies all desires. That's the way to go, really, if you want the best results. Let me just ask you, have you ever been in a team discussion or a group discussion and you felt like you were being constrained, you felt like perhaps the discussion was biased or kind of one-sided? Okay, well if that's the case, then this material I'm presenting today will definitely help you. I'm going to speak briefly about or describe briefly some research that supports shared leadership, and then I'm going to talk about some actual examples that will illustrate this in action. There's 3 different areas that I'm going to cover today that will help you to have more shared leadership and better teamwork. The first area is having to do with the initial framing of how that team is set up initially. The second area is all about broadening the scope of the types of personalities of people that you include on your team. And the third area is about stretching you and your team beyond your current capabilities. There was a research study that was done that involved 43 teams and 184 team members from 2 different companies. This research study showed that if innovation is what you're after, the way to get it is through shared leadership. This study also showed that shared leadership requires a certain type of vertical leadership. To get it, you need transformational leadership and you need empowering leadership. Transformational leadership happens when a leader directs and guides that team towards a clear vision so that they're lifted to a higher purpose. Empowering leadership is all about encouraging. It's when a leader is able to encourage a team member to find his or her own solutions, to learn new things, and to take responsibility without supervision. Finally, the last finding of this study was that the best team members are those who are reliable and dependable, those who let everyone know what they're doing. They're transparent in their actions. How can you get transformational leadership, empowering leadership, and reliable, transparent team members? Well, I'm going to tell you. In fact, I'm going to cover 3 areas today that will help you to have more shared leadership and better teamwork. The first area has to do with the initial framing when you first get together as a team, how the conditions are set up. This could involve a lot of different conditions. For example, it can involve things like what roles people play. It can involve the way the discussion is set up in the beginning when you get together. It involves a lot of things, but just to make this more clear to you, I'm going to give you some specific examples that will show you what I'm talking about. The first example that I'm going to talk about took place at Hughes Aircraft Corporation. Hughes Aircraft has been producing radars and guided missile systems since the 1940s. When they started, their approach was that they just gave their design engineers and design department a lot of freedom. They encouraged them to come up with really great creative products. Then what would happen is that they would throw that design over to the manufacturing department and expect them to be able to produce it. The problem is that putting something on paper and producing it for real, those are kind of two different things, so there's a bit of a gap there. And in fact, sometimes because they were doing this, there would be delays, there would be extra costs involved. Sometimes they would even get in a political battle between the two departments because one department felt like it had to win over the other. The company said, well, we're going to put a referee in there to help iron out the conflicts between the two. But that didn't work. I think maybe the reason it did not work was because they had already been sort of set up as two independent departments, and so it was adversarial from the beginning, just the way it was set up. This all changed in the mid-1950s when Howard Hughes brought in Pat Hyland as the general manager. He worked with the engineers for about a year, and he really changed their attitudes. The main thing that he did that made a huge difference is that he inserted another step in between the design and the manufacturing stage. This step in the middle was the pre-production practice stage. In this stage, the way he had set this up was that it was set up so that the design engineers and the manufacturing engineers would work together. And they did. They had a lot of authority. They could switch around and change the production processes. They could change some of the design criteria. They could change the way the operator instructions went. They could do whatever they needed to do so they could get the configuration so that it would work. This worked like a charm. They saved a lot of money. They started to produce their products on schedule. It was a huge success. My second example, having to do with this initial framing, had to do with mergers and acquisitions. A lot of times when you think about mergers and acquisitions, you think about a large company acquiring a much smaller company, and you can just imagine that that larger company is probably going to dominate over that smaller one. Well, this particular example made history because it truly was a merger of equals. It was about a merger that took place around the 1990s in the pharmaceutical industry. It was about the merger of the Beecham Group in the United Kingdom and SmithKline Beckman of the United States. The two leaders were Robert Bowman and Henry Wendt. They got this all together. Robert Bowman had a lot of skill in team building and working with teams, and so he brought that skill forward to this effort. And together, he and Henry Wendt organized a situation where they had the top 20 operational managers in the very beginning to work in seclusion for many weeks in a basement in Manhattan so they could work out the details of exactly how they would integrate their companies together so that they could have the best of both. And they did it. They created their first business plan that way, and it was a huge success. My third example happened at the Peel Company. The Peel Company is a North American manufacturing company. They make freight elevator doors. What they wanted to know, they participated in an exercise. They had 6 cross-functional teams that participated in this. And the question was, which method of working together is better? They were testing creative problem solving as compared with appreciative inquiry. These methods start out very differently. The way creative problem solving starts out is by having the team members to take a look at problems, obstacles, and limitations of the project, their goal and their project, what they're working on. On the other hand, appreciative inquiry, in that situation, what they do is they look at best practices in the industry. They look at the peak experiences that their team members have had in other projects that might apply to this project. What they found was that appreciative inquiry was best. Why? Because those engineers that were in that cross-functional team were able to build up their confidence, and they just were able to perform better because of that. More positive energy was released because of that. Now, I'm going to share with you some personal experiences that I've had that relate to these examples in a way. My personal experiences that I'll share with you have to do with my experience of helping my dad in Arkansas on the farm. He was a farmer, and I helped him. This is particularly about when I was a teenager. I drove the tractor for him. What's important about the tractor, though, is not the tractor, but the equipment that's behind the tractor. And I'm going to talk today about two different processes, disking and plowing. What's important, and what I'm going to share with you so that you understand this, is the difference in the blades. In disking, the blade is like a frisbee, it's a disc, and the soil is tilled but not very deep. On the other hand, in plowing, the blade is more like a shovel, and it really gets down deep into the earth. One of the first things my dad taught me to do was to disc. Normally when a person discs, the way it works is that you get on the tractor and you drive down to the end of the field, you turn around and come back, and you keep going like that. Well, I was new to disking. I had never done it before. So he came up with a method of teaching me so that I would be successful at it. He did not want me, as a new tractor driver, to go down to the end of the field, turn too short, and get all tangled up with the equipment. That would be a disaster. So instead, he did what they did at Hughes Aircraft. He inserted another step in between there. He had me to go make big circles in the field. That way there was never a chance that I would turn too short. And it worked beautifully. In terms of the second example where I talked about the merger of equals, I should tell you that my dad, of course, I was not really equal to him since he was a farmer and he knew all the ins and outs of farming and I was a child. However, he did treat me like an equal. He let me know that he appreciated me and he appreciated my work and thought it was important. And finally, the third example had to do with the fact that appreciative inquiry was the best result or the best approach that the Peel Company used. When one day my dad came to me and he wanted me to help him with plowing. I had never done plowing before. He took me on the tractor in the field so I could see what it was like, and it was bumpy and I was kind of uncomfortable. And then he approached me and he said he needed me to plow for him because he didn't have anybody else to do it. But he told me he knew that I could do it because I had learned disking and I was great at disking, and he knew I could do that. So he did the appreciative inquiry approach. He built me up and it worked. I accepted his challenge, I did it, and I did a great job. The second area that I'm going to talk about today that will give you more shared leadership and better teamwork has to do with including a broader range of personality types on your teams. The example that I'm going to give comes from, well, first I should say that when you first hear about this, you're probably thinking, that sounds like it would be really hard, different kinds of personality types. It turns out it's actually easier. Why? Because when you have different personalities, you have different views and different perspectives. This means that that team can generate a lot of alternative solutions that makes that team a lot more powerful. The example that I'm giving you today of this came from, I read an article in a mechanical engineering periodical. This is about an annual competition that takes place at Stanford University. What they do is they take their students and divide them up into teams, and they have them participate in this competition. For 13 years, Stanford had 25%, a quarter of their teams would win this prestigious Lincoln Award. Then after 13 years, they changed something that they were doing. What they changed was their selection process of how they put students on these teams. They used a version of the Myers-Briggs methodology. They did not use it in the classical sense because that was going to take too long. What they did is they took that information, they put it into a spreadsheet, and that way they could very quickly put the students into teams. They did this for the next 10 years, and what happened was that they started to win 75% of the Lincoln Awards. In other words, they were able to win 3 times as much of the time. Wow! This was an amazing success. Why? Probably because on each team there were more cognitive modes available. This means more creative problem-solving methods. This was just a much better approach. A team like that could solve just about any problem that it faced. Finally, the last area. Well, okay, wait a minute. I'm going to tell you about, let me ask you, have any of you had the experience of being on a diverse team that was effective, that was successful? That happened to me. During my graduate studies, I was on a lot of different teams. One of these teams was quite amazing because it really was a diverse team. It was the team consisted of someone from Yemen, someone from Ethiopia, a Chinese gentleman who was now working on his 3rd or 4th doctorate degree. He was really smart, and he was a great programmer. This course that we had to do this project for was a systems engineering, computer programming course, but it had a very broad scope. And then I was on this team also, and I didn't really know very much of anything about programming, but at the time, it just so happened I was working part-time for a stockbroker in La Jolla, and that stockbroker took a huge interest in our project. So he gave us all together that in 1997, Business Week named them. They thought very highly of each other. They worked so well together that in 1997, Business Week named them. They thought very highly of each other. They worked so well together that in 1997, Business Week named them. They thought very highly of each other. They worked so well together that in 1997, Business Week named them. They thought very highly of each other. They worked so well together that in 1997, Business Week named them. They thought very highly of each other. They worked so well together that in 1997, Business Week named them. They thought very highly of each other. They worked so well together that in 1997, Business Week named them. They thought very highly of each other. They worked so well together. For political reasons, he did not get picked. Instead, they brought in Bob Eaton from outside the company. Bob Eaton was very smart. He realized that Bob Lutz knew all the ins and outs of Chrysler. He understood the different departments and the way the company worked. And he knew that if he was going to be successful at Chrysler, his best option was to keep Bob Lutz there. So he talked him into staying. And then they formed this partnership to lead the company together. Bob Eaton was a very conservative gentleman. He was a diplomat. He cared about quality. But there's one quality about Bob Eaton that really stands out above the rest, and that is that he was able to allow others to take a leadership role. Bob Lutz was a very different personality type. He had a very charismatic presence. He had been a fighter pilot. He loved racing cars and flying antique airplanes. He came to work every day in a helicopter. He was a larger-than-life figure. He was very good at helping Chrysler in a very hands-on way. He was able to break down the barriers between the different departments and get them to work together. He also helped to raise the technical standards of the production department so that they could produce really great, high-quality cars, and they did. Both Bob Eaton and Bob Lutz led teams of people at Chrysler. They thought very highly of each other. They worked so well together that in 1997, Business Week named them on the list of the world's best executives. They were the only twosome on the list. Finally, the last area that I'm going to talk about today has to do with stretching your skill and broadening your skill while you're working on a project. That sounds very difficult to do, but it can be done. I'm going to give you an example that shows this. Now, this could happen in many different industries. It happens to have taken place in the cosmetics industry. It happened at L'Oreal Paris, and the gentleman who led this event is David Waldorf. He had been with L'Oreal Paris for over 15 years. The company had been very successful. He had been very successful. One day he decided that he wanted to take the company to another level. He wanted a team to help him to create and implement the strategy for the sales organization. He got this team together. It was a very high-level team. It had a lot of VPs on it. It had national sales managers in the three major divisions: cosmetics, nails, and hair. It had operational heads that participated on this team. They all got together, and very early on, this is what happened. They got together, and instead of talking about strategy, well, they would start talking about strategy, but very quickly go into problem-solving mode. So they kind of glossed over things. And they didn't really get into the meat of the matter, the way David Waldorf had envisioned initially. He noticed that they had a tendency, when they started to disagree about something, to avoid it or ignore those areas. No one there really wanted to stand out as being controversial or anything like that. So this was really not quite the team effort that he wanted. David Waldorf realized two things. He realized, number one, every member on this team was willing and was trying really hard to make a contribution. They just did not know how. Another thing he realized, the second thing, was that he did not have the skill to bring them up to a higher level of functioning. So he brought in a coach from outside the company. This coach works with them to help them learn listening skills, assertiveness skills, and conflict management skills. And then I'm going to take a little side trip and tell you about, I'm going to talk about a specific area in terms of assertiveness skills, speaking up. Speaking up can be very important. And this is a little story, something that happened to me when I was a teenager. My dad was taking me out to collect samples for a science project one day. And he was kind of absent-minded, kind of distracted, driving down the road. And we're approaching a train track. And I look up and I see a train and I yell, "Daddy, there's a train!" He slammed on the brakes and the train went barreling down the tracks. If I had not spoken up that day, I would not be standing here now, that's for sure. So speaking up can be very important. And it was important for David Waldorf and his team, for him to teach them that they needed to speak up. And he wanted to also get them to start looking at the sales organization as a whole, not just thinking about their own individual area. That was important. David Waldorf had observed another thing. He observed and he saw that he had a manager that was very aggressive. He had another manager that was passive aggressive. Between the two of them, some factions had formed. on the surface, they all seemed to get along great, but there was some real conflict underneath. The coach worked with them right during their meetings, and he would point out their dysfunction right during the meeting because they were willing to learn and grow and to create the strategy with him. They took that constructive criticism and they made changes right in the moment. And the next thing that happened was truly amazing because they learned to coach each other. They would point out to another team member if they started to exhibit old behavior so that they could correct it right then and there. This meant in the end that David Waldock had a whole team that was dedicated in helping him to create and implement strategy for his sales organization at L'Oreal Paris. F. Scott Fitzgerald said, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." When you serve on a team, you need to be able to entertain opposing ideas. That's very important. If you're in leadership, it's important that the vertical leadership in particular be transformational leadership and empowering leadership. There are 3 areas that I talked about today that will help you have more shared leadership and better teamwork. Number 1, make sure that you set up the initial conditions right, that you pay attention to how it's initially framed, because that initial framing will have an impact on what that team can ultimately produce. And the second area is about broadening your team to include a more diverse personality types. This can really help you. It can be difficult to learn to communicate and cooperate at first, but once you do, your team will be able to solve just about any problem it faces. And finally, the third area is about stretching you and your team beyond your current capabilities. If you're the boss, like David Waldock, and you can set an example like he did, then you're going to be able to lift your team to a higher level of functioning. No one really wants to compromise. The fact of the matter is that compromising may not just be painful, it may be downright undesirable as well. If you want your team to be a high-performing team, make sure you take advantage of shared leadership.